Bureaucracies run on paperwork, and prison is no exception. Essentially, if anything occurred within prison walls that is documentable, they have some way to demonstrate that it happened, and they can put it on paper, they're going to. This is the type of thing that most inmates might not think that much about, but I had a job entitled Lieutenant's Clerk. Essentially, you're an administrative assistant, and my job was to assist both the administrative officials and your run of the mill correctional staff in the preparation of forms. The primary job that I did was assisting in the preparation of RVR 115s. RVR stands for Rules Violations Report. And it's just a form that the administration uses to log wrongdoing committed by an inmate. Essentially, if an officer witnessed or had some specific information about wrongdoing that occurred, somebody broke a rule, it was his job to take the information he had, what his job was, what time the incident had occurred, what inmates were involved, and perhaps a brief description of the incident, and then write it out on a worksheet. He would provide this form to me. My job was to correct any small grammatical or syntactical errors that the officer might have made, and then put it onto an official form for the sergeant or lieutenant on the yard, the administrative official who had authority at that time, to sign off on and submit to the higher levels of the administration, the watch officer and the warden and whatnot. This might be for something relatively innocuous, perhaps an out-of-bounds 115, which would mean that an inmate had simply went past a point in the prison that he was allowed to. Perhaps he had stepped over the yellow line to hand his friend something, or he had wanted to go visit his friend in a cell and stepped through the cell door, which is against the rules. In more extreme cases, these RVR 115s are used in a judicial setting if a felony referral occurs. For instance, if after going into his friend's cell, the inmate had gotten into a fight and they stabbed each other, well, this is a far more serious thing, but the documentation is still very similar. During the summer of 2009, perhaps the spring, which is the time period that I have been describing, wherein the professor and I had set out to get millionaire music producer Phil Spector to hopefully pay to have freezers installed there on E-Yard at SAD-F, there were a couple of interesting occurrences that I haven't had the time to get into at length. One of these was a pretty nasty 115 regarding a drug smuggling ring that I had the misfortune, I suppose, of going through and typing for the administration. You see, this wasn't just anybody who got rolled up because they'd been caught smuggling drugs. My friend Alfalfa had decided that he was going to start selling weed on the yard and had co-opted his wife to smuggle drugs into the institution. He had his friends, Speedy and 11, both of whom I was well acquainted. Speedy had been my cellie back in the hole a couple of months before, and 11 and I had actually served time whenever we were active at High Desert together. We'd been on the yard for years together. Well, all three of them got rolled up by squad just a couple of weeks before the professor and I started trying to get the freezers installed. You see, Alfalfa, I believe, had enjoyed being the big man on campus, as it were. There's a social leverage, a social capital that comes with being a drug dealer. People defer to you in everyday conversation. They might thank you for hooking them up with fill in the blank. Or even if not, everybody else who didn't do drugs was mindful of the fact that you were the dealer. In extreme cases, the last thing you want to do is piss off the guy dealing drugs on the yard. There are a lot of people who would happily go to the hole just to have that guy owe him a favor. Alfalfa hadn't been discreet about the fact that he was getting weed brought in by his wife. So a squad came in and rolled all three of them up. They eventually dropped the report on my lap right around the time that the professor was interviewing with the warden about the procedure to have freezers installed on the yard. I'd known that they were busted, and I think the only people who were surprised whenever squad came in and got the three of them were Alfalfa, Speedy, and 11. Whenever everybody knows that you're the guy dealing drugs, it's only a matter of time until they get you. What I hadn't known was how strong the case against him was, and it was unfortunate to read the rules violation report attached to their lockup report. They had him dead to rights, and it was a bummer to read. Apparently, Alfalfa had been using a simple code to tell his wife what to bring and when. He had called the drugs flowers and had said $2.50 instead of $250. I'm sure at first glance this had seemed clever and like the type of thing that nobody would figure out. But there is a system in place in CDC called Imars, IMARS. That is the Inmate Monitoring and Recording System. They record every call that goes out of the institution, and then they track it to what inmate made the call and whoever it is that they called. There were transcripts from dozens of phone calls between Alfalfa and his wife, and whenever reading the transcripts spread out over a number of phone calls, even if any one of the conversations might not have seemed incriminating, it was very apparent what he was directing her to do whenever you read them all together. Further, there were officer statements regarding catching her in the visiting room with the contraband and inmates that had approached individual officers and given information. And there were incident reports from sheriff's deputies who had searched the wife and taken pictures of her car and found a stash spot. Long story short, it was a wash, and they were going to pick up more time. His wife might as well. I was able to read the report and go by and speak to the cellies of Alfalfa and Speedy and 11. It's a commonly done thing whenever you're locked up to give your cellie your contact information in some way. Here's my mom or my aunt or whoever will get a letter and tell you what it says, just so that if something happens to you, perhaps you get stabbed or you go to the hole because you got caught with drugs or whatever it is, there's some way for the people on the yard to get in touch with you. I'd been hopeful that maybe there was a loophole in the report, some piece of advice I could give them, but there wasn't, and it seemed apropos to at least tell their cellies that. Because I was dealing with this drama, I suppose is the word that we would use, on the day that the professor had his interview with the warden regarding Phil Spector's freezers, the professor and I elected to not go and talk to Phil Spector that day. But the warden had expressed to the professor that there was no reason that he would be against Phil Spector donating a freezer and the money to install it to the institution. In addition to preparing the RVR on my friends, which there were some days that I particularly didn't like my job, and this was definitely one of them, I also prepared a short memo for the warden to sign regarding the things that he was willing to have donated to the institution, and the fact that if the freezer was placed on a yard, it would be for the use of the general inmate body. There was a yellow form, the number of which I can't remember, perhaps a 1036, entitled Inmate Donation to the Institution, which had to be filled out by both Phil Spector and the warden. And there were a number of other small pieces of paperwork that had to be drafted and eventually signed. There was one other exciting piece of paperwork that I had done this day. I'd been waiting on a cell move. If you want to trade cells in an institution, you want to move from one bunk to another, one cell to another, it's not as simple as just picking up your stuff and moving. Even if you and the guy that are trading bunks might want to move, the officers in your building, of course, have to agree that it's okay. People can't just move at random. But even were they to say, yes, we want Frank to trade with Bob, well, there has to be a record of this having been done. If the cops show up and want to interrogate an inmate, they have to know what bed he is in, mail has to be delivered, etc., etc. The procedure for a cell move, and I was well acquainted with this as a lieutenant's clerk. I actually got to type up the paperwork on having a new person moved into my cell on this day. I hadn't been getting along with my cellie, AJ. Things had become tense, and I was concerned he and I were going to get into it. As a result, I traded him out for a gentleman with whom I was acquainted on the lower tier named Brandon. I can't say we were friends, but we were acquainted, and he was a good cellie insofar as that goes. And the entire time that I lived with him, I don't think I had any complaints about his behavior or conduct. First, we had approached the officers and explained that we wanted to have AJ and Brandon traded. From there, they did a brief interview with the four of us and just made sure that AJ, Brandon, AJ's cellie, and myself were all amenable to the move. They noted the names, the CDC numbers, and the housing of all four of us, and then set it aside to hopefully be done at some point in the future on a day whenever they weren't busy. It's never done on your schedule if you want to cell move. Even if it's urgent, even if it's he and I are going to kill each other right now, be prepared for the cops to say, well, you're going to have to kill each other after lunch because we got other things we're doing. On this day, while I was working, typing up these reports and the paperwork for the freezers, I got a call from my building officer, with whom I was, of course, well acquainted, and he said, hey, Channel, the move you wanted to do is going through. So we're calling it in, and he gave me the information that I had already given him. This was so that I could type it up on an official form, a 154, it's called. A 154 is a cell move form. All I had to do was get the names in the right boxes, noting what housing goes to where, and take it to the sergeant on the yard who was in charge of this type of thing. It was his job to review it and make sure that there was no trickery going on. After all, a correctional officer had called in those names, and if I wanted, I could have put anybody's names in these boxes, and he might have signed it anyway. I never saw a sergeant or a lieutenant do the due diligence that you would expect to verify that inmates were going where the clerk had said they were. I suppose they just elected to trust that the clerk that they were working with, if he was going to lie, well, he'd get fired and there'd be consequences, and so it wouldn't generally happen. But I have heard some horror stories of inmates who were clerks or who were acquainted with clerks, moving somebody that didn't want to be moved into their cell in, or finding some way to manipulate the system to the detriment of somebody being moved. On this occasion, the sergeant had to sign this form in quadruplet. There are 4 copies. One copy is posted on his board right then. It is his record of the move that he signed in case anything goes wrong later in the process. He then takes the form and gives it to the officer with the title of S&E number 1. You have to understand, there are a lot of cops working in an institution. Even on just 1 yard, there's 30 or 40 cops working, and there can be 5 or 6 or 7 yards on an institution. Jobs have different job titles. Officers perform different functions. You have building officers whose job consists primarily of working in the building with the inmates. You have mailroom officers who almost never see inmates. They sort and process mail. The job title S&E number 1 stands for Search and Escort Officer, and he's the number 1 officer with this job title. There are generally 10 or 15 on an institution. S&E number 1 also has the job of overseeing the inmate clerks, so I was well acquainted with Officer Moore, who was doing this job at this time. As I recall, whenever he saw that it was my cell that was having somebody moved into and out of, he made a little joke, oh, Channel, you can't get along with anybody, or whatever the heck it was he said. And he went up to the watch office to process the remaining 3 forms that the sergeant had signed. I have no idea what happens to these forms whenever they arrive at the watch office. I never actually spoke to any inmate that had worked in the watch office. All I know about it is it's the high security area off to the side of the prison that most inmates don't go to, and where they send the forms whenever they're doing a cell move. Well, Officer Moore took the 3 remaining signed forms up to the watch office. I would assume that the administrative officials there did things like examine the forms, made sure that they weren't fake, went through the paperwork of the files of the inmates in question and made sure they weren't enemies and weren't going to attack each other on sight or anything absurd like that, and then kept 2 copies for themselves and sent him back to the yard with 1 processed copy, saying that it was acceptable for the guy that I was moving into my cell, Brandon, to be moved in. His housing had changed and that AJ had to go down to the cell he wanted to move in. He took this to the building. It was posted on the board there so that everybody could know that it was legitimate. And the officers called me up in the clerk's office and let me know, hey, Channel, your move went through. You might want to come over here and get your 1 cellie out and your new cellie in. This was a lot of paperwork to process in a day, and I barely got it done in time to go back to my building and help AJ get his stuff out of my cell, essentially. Brandon moved in, and moving from one cell to another can be quite a process. It's the type of thing that most people might not think about, but inmates can accrue a lot of things over the course of their term. You figure you might live in a cell for years or even decades in extreme cases. You've put things on the wall, you've collected paperwork. If you're lucky, you have canteens, zoom zooms and whim whams, soups and chips under your bed. It all adds up to a lot of stuff to move whenever you couple with it your bedding and your clothes and the things that, inmates use on a day-to-day basis. Getting moved into my cell, as I recall, took Brandon a total of 3 or 4 hours to be entirely situated and put things where he wanted them to be. Over this time, we broke out the Scrabble board, played a game, I think, and talked, got used to each other as new roommates. This day in the summer or spring of 2009, this was all relatively routine paperwork that I processed. Mind you, it wasn't every day that the cops busted up a drug ring, but there were 115s every day that I would type. This day it was different because it was my friends that were getting rolled up. I'd known 11 for years. We'd been active at High Desert together. Speedy and I had been in the hole together. We'd been cellies, and Alfalfa and I considered Alfalfa a friend. He seemed like a decent and kind man. Whenever he was back in the shoe, he'd donated his hair to Locks of Love. That'll always stand out to me as a really cool thing for him to have done. And they all went to the hole. Alfalfa's wife likely picked up a prison sentence over what happened, or at least was facing one. Additionally, cell moves. I processed dozens of cell moves in a week. But the only time that it really stood out to me as, wow, this is an important cell move, is whenever I was moving somebody into my cell. I've been thinking about this for the past couple of days. That we go through life and things seem routine, mundane, and ordinary. Cell moves and 115s, I typed that paperwork all the stinking time. But this time it stood out because it was about me, like I'm special somehow. These are my friends that are getting rolled up, and this is somebody moving into my cell. So it seemed important somehow. It had to get done right. But I get to thinking about the jobs that we do every day. You might work in a lab processing blood samples, and it's very mundane and routine. You put on the reagent, you check to see what the results are, you check a box, you click a couple of buttons on your computer, and then you do it again and again and again all day long. I can't think of anything more mind-numbingly routine. Similarly, you could have a service job. You might be serving a meal to a family, delivering their food and their drinks. And while it may be routine to you, the 70-year-old woman who's there to have her birthday that you might just spill a glass of ice water on if you're not careful, oh my goodness, that is not a routine occurrence for her. She's out for her 70th birthday and she's trusting that you're going to give her the best service that you possibly can. You might work servicing cars. Whenever you're fixing somebody's brakes, you're just doing your job. But whenever somebody's fixing your brakes, that's not just them doing their job. It's life or death. Your wife and your kids' precious cargo go in that car. So, if you catch yourself in your everyday life, whatever you might be doing, thinking that the things that you're doing are unimportant, routine, and mundane, do remember that life is never unimportant. It's magical. And we really need to bring as much attention, as much focus as we can to our everyday lives. Because the longer you think about it and the more that you realize how everything is interconnected, nothing is routine or mundane. It's all life or death. Thank you for listening today.